Some betrayals cut deeper than any sword, and some words spoken in anger can never be taken back. In one moment, 20 years of marriage can be reduced to nothing more than marks on parchment. Gunnar Ironhand stands in his clan hall, ready to divorce the woman who stood by him through war and hardship. His new bride waits beside him, certain of her victory. His first wife, Solveig, watches from across the room as her world crumbles. The clan elder prepares to make it official. But when old Torsten Grey-Eye opens his mouth, something unexpected happens. This man, who has buried children and lost wives, decides to speak from the heart instead of from the law. What could an elder possibly say that would bring 3 proud people to tears in front of the entire clan? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Clan Solveig stretched before them like a cathedral of wood and iron, its massive oak beams blackened by decades of hearth smoke and the breath of countless gatherings. Carved dragon heads snarled down from the support posts, their eyes seeming to follow the movements of those gathered below. The central fire pit glowed with steady flames, casting dancing shadows that made the carved runes along the walls appear to writhe with ancient meaning. Gunnar Ironhand stood at the head of the hall, his broad shoulders squared beneath a cloak of deep blue wool bordered with silver thread. At 45 winters, he remained an imposing figure, tall as a mountain pine, with arms that had wielded sword and axe through more battles than most men could count. His beard, once golden as summer wheat, now bore threads of silver that caught the firelight. The scars that marked his hands and forearms told stories of raids across the North Sea, of victories that had brought wealth and honor to his people. Yet for all his prowess in war, Gunnar's greatest failure stood evident in the very ceremony that brought them here today. His marriage to Solveig had produced no heir, no son to carry forward the bloodline of Solveig, no daughter to forge alliances through marriage. In a world where legacy meant everything, this absence echoed louder than any war cry. Beside him stood Thyra Eriksdottir, 28 winters old and radiant with the confidence of youth and beauty. Her hair fell in intricate braids, adorned with small silver bells that chimed softly when she moved her head. The daughter of Jarl Erik the Bold, from the neighboring clan Ravensholm. She represented more than just a new wife. She was a bridge between territories, a promise of stronger alliances, and most importantly, the hope of children who would secure Gunnar's line. Thyra's green eyes surveyed the gathered clan with the calculating gaze of someone who understood power and how to wield it. She wore a gown of finest wool, dyed the color of deep forest, with golden brooches at her shoulders that caught and held the light. Her bearing spoke of a woman accustomed to being desired, to having her beauty and status open doors that remained closed to others. Across the hall, separated by 20 feet of stone floor and 20 years of shared history, stood Solveig the healer. At 43 winters, she possessed a different kind of beauty, one earned through wisdom and service, rather than granted by birth. Her dark hair, streaked with early silver, was bound back in a simple braid without ornament. She wore a dress of undyed wool, practical and worn, with sleeves that bore the faint stains of healing herbs and the marks of countless hours spent tending to the sick and wounded. At her side hung the artifact that defined her role in the clan, a worn leather pouch that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. The healing pouch contained carefully gathered herbs, ground stones with medicinal properties, and small tools for treating wounds. It represented decades of knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with swords, but with patience, skill, and the ancient wisdom of healing. Solveig's hands, still steady despite the trembling in her heart, rested calmly at her sides. Those hands had delivered babies, set broken bones, and closed the eyes of the dying. They had comforted Gunnar through the fever dreams that followed his worst battle wounds, had prepared his armor before every raid, had worked tirelessly to build the prosperity that now allowed him the luxury of casting her aside. The clan members who filled the hall represented the full spectrum of Svolder society. Weathered warriors leaned against the walls, their faces bearing the marks of campaigns fought alongside Gunnar. Their wives clustered in small groups, whispering among themselves about the unprecedented nature of this gathering. Children peered between adult legs, sensing the tension without fully understanding its source. Near the great doors stood the visiting dignitaries from Clan Ravensholm. Thyra's father, Eric the Bold, a man whose reputation for ruthless political maneuvering matched his skill with a battle axe. His presence here served multiple purposes: to witness his daughter's elevation, to formalize the alliance between clans, and to ensure that no insult would be offered to his family line. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken judgments and carefully maintained neutrality. Some among the clan had benefited directly from Solveig's healing skills, mothers whose children lived because of her knowledge, warriors whose wounds had healed clean under her care. Others looked toward the future with practical eyes, understanding that political alliances sometimes required personal sacrifices, even painful ones. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a platform that had been carved from a single massive oak tree, stood the judgment seat where Elder Torsten Grey-Eye presided over matters of law and custom. At 72 winters, Torsten had outlived most of his generation, earning his position through the accumulation of wisdom rather than strength of arm. His hair had long since turned white as fresh snow, and his beard reached nearly to his belt. One eye had been lost to a Saxon spear 30 years past, but the remaining grey eye seemed to see deeper into men's souls than most could see with two. Torsten wore the simple brown robes of his office, unadorned except for the silver arm ring that marked his authority as law speaker. In his weathered hands he held the scrolls and implements necessary for the dissolution of marriage bonds, a ceremony that had been performed only 3 times. In his long tenure as elder, the hall's atmosphere crackled with tension as competing loyalties and unspoken alliances shifted like currents beneath ice. Some clan members had already chosen sides, though none would speak openly until the elder had pronounced judgment. The older women, particularly those who had received Solveig's care during difficult childbirths, seemed to regard the proceedings with barely concealed disapproval. The younger warriors, perhaps swayed by Thyra's beauty or the promise of stronger military alliances, appeared more accepting of the change. Gunnar himself seemed caught between worlds, the honorable leader who had never broken his word in battle, now preparing to break the most sacred vow a man could make. His jaw worked silently as he struggled with thoughts he could not voice, emotions that had no place in a ceremony governed by law and custom rather than feeling. The firelight played across faces both familiar and strange, illuminating expressions of curiosity, judgment, sympathy, and calculation. This was more than a simple legal proceeding. It was a moment that would define relationships and alliances for years to come. The children present would remember this day when they became adults. The stories they heard here would be retold around countless future fires. As Elder Torsten prepared to begin the formal proceedings, the weight of history seemed to settle over the hall like a heavy cloak. The carved runes on the walls spoke of ancestors who had faced their own difficult choices, of generations who had navigated the treacherous waters between personal desire and duty to clan and family. In the growing silence, 3 lives hung balanced on the edge of irrevocable change, while an entire community prepared to witness the transformation of their understanding about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of honor. Elder Torsten Grey-Eye rose from his carved judgment seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests for support. The hall fell silent, except for the crackling of the central fire and the soft whisper of wind through the smoke hole above. Every eye turned toward the ancient man, whose word carried the weight of law and tradition. "We gather today," Torsten began, his voice carrying despite its age, to witness the dissolution of marriage bonds between Gunnar Ironhand, son of Magnus and Solveig Eric's daughter of the healing line. His words echoed off the carved wooden walls, formal and ceremonial. Let all present bear witness to what transpires here. For what is spoken in this hall shall be remembered and honored. Gunnar stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, not from aggression, but from the nervous habit of a warrior seeking comfort in familiar weight. On the wall behind Torsten hung Gunnar's war axe, the artifact that had defined his reputation and brought honor to his name. The weapon's blade bore the marks of countless battles, its handle worn smooth by the grip of calloused hands. It represented everything Gunnar excelled at: leadership in war, courage in battle, the ability to protect and provide for his people through strength of arm. Yet for all the victories that axe had witnessed, it could not win the battle that mattered most. It could not grant children to a marriage that had grown cold with disappointment and unfulfilled expectations. Gunnar Ironhand, Torsten continued, speak now the reasons for this petition. Let the clan hear why you seek to sever bonds that were blessed by the gods and witnessed by your people. Gunnar's throat worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. When he spoke, the words came out measured and careful, as if he had rehearsed them many times. Elder, honored members of Clan Svolder, I come before you today with a heavy heart but clear purpose. For 20 winters, Solveig and I have shared hearth and home. She has been a loyal wife, a skilled healer, and a credit to our clan. He paused, and in that silence the weight of what he was about to say seemed to settle over the hall like a physical presence. But the gods have not blessed our union with children. No son has been born to carry forward the line of Svolder, no daughter to bind our clan to others through marriage alliance. I am no longer young, and the responsibilities of leadership demand that I think beyond my own desires to the future of our people. Several clan members shifted uncomfortably. The childlessness that had haunted Gunnar's marriage was known to all, but hearing it spoken aloud in such formal terms gave it a finality that felt harsh even to those who understood the practical necessities. Thyra stood straighter, her chin lifting with pride and anticipation. The silver bells in her hair chimed softly as she moved, a sound that seemed almost musical against the heavy silence. Her green eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a woman who saw her value being publicly acknowledged. Furthermore, Gunnar continued, his voice growing stronger as he pushed through the difficult words, an alliance has been offered by Jarl Eric the Bold of Clan Ravensholm. His daughter, Thyra, Eric's daughter, brings not only the promise of children, but the security of joined territories and shared strength against our enemies. Jarl Eric nodded approvingly from his position near the great doors, his weathered face showing satisfaction at hearing his daughter's value properly acknowledged. The political marriage he had negotiated would strengthen both clans and secure his daughter's future. A practical arrangement that served everyone's interests, I ask. Gunnar concluded. That the bonds between Solveig and myself be formally dissolved, that she be granted appropriate settlement for her years of service, and that the path be cleared for a union that will serve the future of our people. The formal nature of his words could not disguise the effort they cost him. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped back, and those who knew him best could see the conflict written in the tight lines around his eyes. Now all attention turned to Solveig. According to custom, she had the right to speak in her own defense, to contest the divorce if she chose, or to accept it with whatever dignity she could muster. Solveig stepped forward with the same calm composure she brought to tending the wounded. Her healing pouch swayed gently at her side, a reminder of all the times she had knelt beside sickbeds, offering comfort to those facing their darkest hours. Now she faced her own darkness with the same steady courage. Elder Torsten, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, I will not contest my husband's petition. What he says is true. No children have blessed our marriage despite our hopes and prayers. I have served Clan Svolder faithfully for 20 winters, and I will not burden it with conflict in my final act as Gunnar's wife." Her words carried a dignity that made several of the older women in the hall nod with approval. This was how a proper wife should behave, with grace even in defeat, thinking of the clan's welfare above her own pain. "I ask only," Solveig continued, "that I be permitted to remain within the territory of Svolder as healer to those who require my services. My knowledge belongs to this land and these people, not to any single family or marriage bond." Thira's eyes flashed with something that might have been annoyance or concern. A divorced wife remaining nearby was not part of the clean break she had envisioned, but protocol demanded that such practical matters be addressed after the formal dissolution. Elder Torsten studied all three participants with his single grey eye, weighing their words and the currents of emotion that flowed beneath the formal speeches. As law speaker, he had presided over many difficult decisions, but something about this particular case seemed to trouble him more than usual. "The petition appears to be in order," he said slowly, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "The reasons given are sufficient under our customs, and both parties have spoken their agreement to the terms." He reached for the divorce decree, a scroll of prepared parchment that would make the dissolution legal and binding once signed and witnessed. The document represented finality, the transformation of 20 years of shared life into a matter of legal record. "Let the marriage bonds be brought forward for the cutting," Torsten commanded. From a wooden chest beside his chair, an assistant retrieved the physical cord that had been used to bind Gunnar and Solveig's hands during their wedding ceremony 20 years earlier. The braided rope, woven from fibers that had been blessed by the priests of Thor and Frigg, had been preserved as a symbol of their union. Now it would be cut to symbolize that union's end. As the cord was laid out on a small table before the elder's chair, the reality of what was happening began to sink in for everyone present. The younger clan members who had never witnessed a divorce looked on with fascination and discomfort. The older ones, who remembered Gunnar and Solveig's wedding day, felt the weight of how much had changed. Gunnar's hand went unconsciously to his throat, where he wore a small pendant that Solveig had given him on their wedding night, a piece of carved amber that was said to protect warriors in battle. He had worn it through every raid, every skirmish, every moment of danger. Now, as he prepared to cut the cord that bound them, he wondered if he should remove it as well. Thyra watched the proceedings with growing excitement barely contained beneath her composed exterior. Soon she would stand where Solveig now stood, but as a bride rather than a cast-off wife. The alliance with Svolder would elevate her status and secure her future in ways that her beauty alone never could. But as Elder Torsten lifted the ceremonial knife that would cut the marriage cord, something in his expression shifted. The routine nature of the proceedings seemed to weigh on him, and those who knew him well could see that he was wrestling with thoughts that went beyond mere legal protocol. The fire in the central pit suddenly flared brighter, as if the gods themselves were preparing to bear witness to what would happen next. In that heightened moment, with the knife poised above the cord and 3 lives hanging in the balance, Elder Torsten paused. His single grey eye swept across the faces of Gunnar, Thyra and Solveig, seeing not just the legal participants in a dissolution ceremony, but 3 human beings whose lives were about to be changed forever. The weight of his own experiences, the wives he had loved and lost, the children he had buried, the mistakes he had made in his own long life, seemed to press down upon him like a physical burden. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the hall hung in perfect silence, waiting for the final act that would sever 20 years of marriage and clear the path for new alliances, new hopes, and new disappointments yet to come. The silence in the hall seemed to pull Elder Torsten backward through the years, his weathered mind drifting to memories of another time, another ceremony, when hope had burned brighter than fear. As his fingers traced the handle of the ceremonial knife, he found himself remembering the day Gunnar and Solveig had first stood before him as newlyweds. It had been the harshest winter in living memory, 21 years past. The fjords had frozen solid, trapping their longships in ice that seemed thick as stone. Food stores ran dangerously low, and the weaker members of the clan, the very old and very young, began to succumb to cold and hunger. It was during this dark time that Gunnar, then barely 24 and newly proven in his first major raid, had requested permission to marry Solveig, the healer's daughter. The clan banner that now hung above them, its fabric worn thin by decades of wind and weather, had fluttered proudly that day despite the bitter cold. The same banner that had been carried into battle by Gunnar's father Magnus and his grandfather before him. It represented not just the bloodline of Svolder, but the weight of expectation that came with leadership. Even then, as a young man drunk on new love, Gunnar had understood that his choice of wife would echo through generations. But love had seemed to conquer all practical concerns. Solveig had already proven herself invaluable during that terrible winter, working tirelessly to treat frostbite and fever, stretching their meager supplies of healing herbs to last until spring's thaw. Her knowledge, inherited from her mother and grandmother, had literally saved lives. When old Bjorn the blacksmith collapsed with lung fever, it was Solveig's poultices and careful nursing that pulled him back from the edge of death. When young Astrid's baby came too early during a blizzard, Solveig's steady hands and ancient wisdom ensured both mother and child survived. Gunnar had watched her work with the same admiration he usually reserved for master craftsmen or legendary warriors. Here was a different kind of strength, not the obvious power of sword and shield, but the quiet determination to preserve life in the face of death's constant threats. When he approached her father to request her hand, he spoke of building something lasting together, of combining his ability to protect the clan with her ability to heal it. Their wedding had been a brief but joyful affair, held in this same hall, when it was packed with clan members seeking warmth and community during the endless dark months. Torsten remembered how Gunnar's face had glowed with happiness as he spoke his vows, how Solveig's eyes had shone with tears of joy rather than the tears of sorrow she now fought to contain. The marriage cord that now lay before them waiting to be cut had been braided by the clan's women from fibers blessed at the shrine of Frigg, goddess of marriage and motherhood. As Torsten had bound their hands together that long-ago day, both, bride and groom, had spoken earnestly of their hopes for children, for sons who would carry on the Svolder name and daughters who would bind their clan to others through marriage. Those early years had been golden ones for the young couple. Gunnar's reputation as a war leader grew with each successful raid, bringing wealth and prestige to the clan. His careful strategies and fierce courage in battle earned him the nickname Ironhand, not for the strength of his grip, but for his ability to hold his men together in the most desperate fighting. Each spring brought new victories, each autumn brought ships heavy with plunder and slaves. But it was Solveig who managed the home front, ensuring that the clan's increasing prosperity was wisely managed. She expanded her healing practice, training other women in the medicinal arts, and establishing Svolder's reputation as a place where the sick and wounded could find expert care. When injured warriors from other clans sought her services, they often stayed to trade or negotiate alliances, adding to the clan's growing influence. The couple's partnership had extended beyond their marriage into their roles as leaders. Gunnar would return from raids with exotic herbs and rare substances that Solveig could use in her healing work. She would tend his wounds and those of his men, ensuring that Svolder's warriors could fight again, rather than suffering the lingering disabilities that plagued many veteran fighters. During the harsh winter months when raiding was impossible, they would plan together, Gunnar strategizing about which territories to target come spring, Solveig calculating what supplies would be needed to support longer expeditions. Their private conversations, conducted in the small chamber behind the main hall, became legendary among the clan for their length and intensity. Here were two intelligent people building something greater than either could achieve alone. But as the years passed, The absence that haunted their private chambers began to cast shadows over their public success. Each autumn brought hope that Solveig might be carrying a child. Each winter brought the renewed disappointment when those hopes proved false. The clan's older women began to whisper about curses and divine displeasure. The younger warriors, eager for their own advancement, began to speak quietly about what would happen to Svolder's leadership if Gunnar died without an heir. Solveig tried every remedy known to her healing arts. She made pilgrimages to sacred groves where women prayed to Frigg for fertility. She consulted with wise women from distant clans, trading precious silver arm rings for potions and rituals that promised to open her womb. Gunnar, for his part, offered sacrifices to Thor and Odin, burning valuable goods in hopes that the gods would look favorably on their desire for children. The strain began to tell in subtle ways. Their easy conversations grew stilted, overshadowed by the unspoken question that hung between them. Their physical intimacy, once joyful and spontaneous, became calculated around the moon's phases and the recommendations of fertility experts. The chamber that had once echoed with laughter and planning now often fell silent, filled with the weight of unfulfilled longing. Other clan members, particularly the women who had benefited from Solveig's healing skills, watched the couple struggle with sympathy and concern. They remembered their own fears during difficult pregnancies, their own relief when healthy children were finally born. Many of them had personal reasons to be grateful to Solveig. Mothers whose children lived because of her knowledge, wives whose husbands had returned from battle whole because of her care. But sympathy could not change the fundamental reality that governed Viking society. Without an heir, even the most successful leader was building a legacy that would crumble upon his death. The clan needed continuity, the assurance that leadership would pass smoothly from one generation to the next. As Gunnar entered his fourth decade and Solveig approached her 40th year, that continuity seemed increasingly unlikely. The conversations in the Great Hall began to change. Where once clan members had spoken confidently about the future under Gunnar's leadership, now they began to speculate about alternatives. Some suggested that Gunnar might adopt a promising young warrior as his heir. Others whispered about the possibility of a second marriage, perhaps keeping Solveig as first wife while taking a younger woman specifically for childbearing. These whispers reached Solveig's ears, as such whispers always do. Rather than raging against the injustice or fighting to maintain her position, she withdrew into her healing work with even greater dedication. If she could not give the clan an heir, she would give it everything else within her power: her knowledge, her skill, her unwavering service to any who needed care. Elder Torsten, watching from his position as the clan's memory and conscience, saw the slow transformation of a love match into a partnership burdened by impossible expectations. He remembered his own marriages, his own struggles with the gap between personal desire and duty to the clan. The weight of leadership, he knew, could crush even the strongest bonds if the burden became too great to bear. The first time Thera, Eric's daughter, had set foot in the hall of Clan Svolder, she had worn the golden arm ring that now caught the firelight as she stood beside Gunnar. The ornate jewelry, crafted by the finest smiths of Ravensholm, gleamed with intricate knotwork patterns that spoke of wealth and status far beyond what most clan daughters could claim. Unlike Solveig's simple healing pouch with its worn leather and practical contents, Thyra's arm ring proclaimed its owner's value through pure display of precious metal and masterful craftsmanship. That had been 6 months ago, during the spring gathering, when neighboring clans came together to settle disputes, arrange trades, and negotiate the alliances that would shape the coming year's campaigns. Thyra had arrived as part of her father's delegation, ostensibly to observe the proceedings and learn about diplomacy, but everyone present understood her true purpose. At 28, she was past the age when most women married, but her beauty and her father's wealth had allowed her to be selective about potential matches. The moment she entered the hall, Conversations had shifted. Warriors who had been discussing raid strategies suddenly found themselves smoothing their beards and adjusting their finest cloaks. Even married men stole glances at the striking young woman whose golden hair seemed to capture and hold the light of every torch. But Thyra's green eyes had quickly identified the most important man in the room, and her attention had focused on Gunnar with the precision of an archer selecting a target. Gunnar, for his part, had tried to maintain appropriate protocol during those early interactions. As a married man and clan leader, he understood the importance of avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. But Thyra possessed a gift for creating situations where protocol seemed to bend naturally around her desires. She would ask intelligent questions about Svolder's defenses that required detailed answers. She would compliment his leadership in ways that seemed genuine rather than flattering. She would position herself where he could not help but notice her beauty while maintaining perfect decorum. The political advantages of a marriage alliance with Ravensholm had been obvious to everyone, but they became irresistible when presented through Thyra's carefully orchestrated courtship. Her father, Jarl Eric the Bold, was known throughout the region for his cunning and his ability to position his clan advantageously in every conflict. An alliance with him would not only strengthen Svolder's military position, but also provide access to trade routes and political connections that could secure prosperity for generations. During those spring negotiations, Thyra had taken every opportunity to demonstrate her value as a potential wife and clan leader. She showed familiarity with the management of large households, discussing grain stores and livestock breeding, with the authority of someone who understood the practical aspects of leadership. She displayed knowledge of genealogies and alliance, networks that would be crucial for arranging her own children's marriages. Most importantly, she radiated the confidence of a woman who expected to bear healthy children and saw that expectation as her most valuable asset. The contrast with Solveig during those same gatherings had been painful for all who witnessed it. Where Thyra glowed with youthful confidence, Solveig seemed to withdraw into herself, focusing intensely on her healing work, as if trying to prove her worth through service rather than fertility. She spent long hours tending to minor injuries and illnesses among the visiting clans, her healing pouch never far from her side as she went about the work that defined her identity. But if Solveig hoped that demonstrating her value as a healer would protect her position, she had underestimated the forces already in motion. Private conversations between Gunnar and Jarl Erik had begun almost immediately, conducted in the careful language of diplomacy, but moving steadily toward a concrete proposal. The two men understood each other perfectly. Both were leaders who had learned to separate personal feelings from political necessity. Thyra herself had participated in these negotiations with surprising directness. Unlike many women of her status who left such matters entirely to their fathers, she had made it clear that she expected to be consulted about her own future. During a private moment with Gunnar, she had spoken frankly about her expectations from marriage, children first and foremost, but also a partnership in leadership that would honor both her intelligence and her family connections. "I have watched my father's marriages," she had told him during one of their carefully chaperoned conversations. "The successful ones are built on more than attraction or even affection. They require shared goals and mutual respect for what each partner brings to the alliance." Her words had impressed Gunnar with their maturity and practical wisdom. Here was a woman who understood the realities of leadership, who could be a true partner in building Svolder's future rather than simply a vessel for producing heirs. The more he spoke with her, the more the idea of divorce began to seem not just politically advantageous, but personally appealing. Yet even as these conversations progressed, Gunnar found himself struggling with guilt over his growing excitement about the prospect of a new marriage. Solveig had done nothing to deserve abandonment except fail to conceive children, something that might not even be her fault. The wise women spoke of many causes for childlessness, and some blamed the man as often as the woman. But in a society where women bore the primary responsibility for fertility, the burden of failure had fallen entirely on Solveig's shoulders. The formal negotiations had concluded by midsummer, with both clans agreeing to the marriage alliance in principle. The divorce from Solveig was presented as a necessary preliminary step, regrettable but unavoidable given the political realities. Jarl Erik had been generous in his terms, offering not just his daughter's hand, but also substantial bride price and favorable trade agreements that would benefit Svolder for years to come. During the months that followed, as legal preparations were made for the divorce ceremony, Thyra had made several more visits to Svolder. Each time, she had demonstrated greater familiarity with the clan's operations and shown increasing confidence in her future role. She had begun to speak of changes she hoped to implement, improvements to the Great Hall, expansion of trade relationships, new approaches to managing the clan's growing wealth. These plans, discussed openly and enthusiastically, had been impossible for Solveig to ignore. Each conversation about the future seemed to emphasize how completely she would be erased from it. The healing work that had defined her contribution to the clan would continue, but under the direction of new leadership. The chamber she had shared with Gunnar for 20 years would be redecorated to suit a younger woman's tastes. Even the herb garden she had carefully cultivated would likely be replanted according to different preferences. But if Thyra felt any guilt about displacing another woman, she hid it well behind the practical arguments that supported her position. She was younger, fertile, and brought valuable political connections. She represented hope for the future rather than disappointment about the past. In a world where survival often depended on making hard choices, her ascendancy seemed as natural and inevitable as the changing of seasons. As she now stood beside Gunnar, waiting for Elder Torsten to complete the ceremony that would clear the path for her own wedding, Thyra allowed herself to imagine the life that lay ahead. Children who would carry forward the bloodlines of both Svolder and Ravensholm. Alliances that would make both clans stronger and more prosperous. A legacy that would endure long after her own death, built on the foundation of this marriage that seemed to serve everyone's interests. The golden arm ring on her wrist caught the firelight as she shifted position slightly, its gleaming surface reflecting the flames like a promise of the bright future she was prepared to build on the ashes of another. Woman's dreams, the hearthstones that formed the sacred circle around the central fire, had witnessed countless gatherings over the generations, celebrations of victory, mourning for the fallen, ceremonies marking the passage from childhood to adulthood. These ancient stones, each one carefully selected and blessed by the clan's first settlers, represented the eternal heart of Svolder's identity. They had been laid by Gunnar's great-grandfather when the hall was first built, arranged according to patterns older than memory, designed to channel the protective spirits that watched over family and clan. Now those same stones seemed to radiate a different kind of energy, the tension of a community watching its fundamental structures shift beneath their feet. Around the sacred fire, relationships that had seemed permanent for decades were being redefined with each word spoken in the divorce ceremony. The very concept of marriage, which these people had always seen as a bond blessed by the gods and strengthened by time, was being revealed as something that could be dissolved when it no longer served practical purposes. For Solveig, the dissolution meant more than just the loss of a husband. As Gunnar's wife, she had held a position of honor and influence that extended far beyond their private relationship. She had been the clan's primary healer, yes, but also the woman other wives came to for advice about household management, child-rearing, and the delicate politics of clan life. Her voice carried weight in decisions about resource allocation, trade negotiations, and the settlement of disputes between families. All of that would change once the marriage bonds were cut. Technically, she would remain within the clan as a healer, but her status would be fundamentally altered. No longer the wife of the chieftain, She would become something unprecedented in Svolder's history, a divorced woman of middle age, valued for her skills but no longer central to the clan's future planning. The younger women who had once sought her counsel would now look to Thyra for guidance about fashion, household management, and the social connections that shaped clan politics. The practical implications were staggering when considered in detail. The chamber behind the great hall that had been her home for 20 years would need to be prepared for Thyra. Solveig would move to smaller quarters, probably near the healing house, where she could focus entirely on her medical practice. Her personal possessions, the tapestries she had woven during long winter evenings, the carved wooden chests that held her finest clothing, the silver jewelry that marked her status as chieftain's wife would need to be sorted according to what belonged to her personally versus what belonged to her position. Even her relationship with the clan's children would change. As Gunnar's wife, she had served as a kind of surrogate mother to the entire community, someone children could approach for comfort or guidance when their own parents were unavailable. Now those same children would learn to see her differently, not as a maternal figure representing stability and continuity, but as a cautionary tale about what could happen when a woman failed to fulfill her primary biological function. For Gunnar, the emotional cost was equally complex, but harder to define. He was gaining a politically advantageous marriage and the hope of children, but losing 20 years of shared history and understanding. Solveig knew his preferences in food, his habits when preparing for battle, his moods, and the small gestures that could lift his spirits after difficult decisions. She understood his fears and insecurities in ways that no new wife could match, regardless of her other virtues. There was also the question of how the clan would judge his decision. While most members understood the political necessity, some of the older warriors who had fought beside him for decades looked uncomfortable with the proceedings. These men had wives of their own, partnerships built over years of shared struggle, and they could easily imagine themselves in Gunnar's position if fate had denied them children. Their expressions suggested they were questioning not just this specific divorce, but the broader implications for marriage stability within the clan. The younger warriors, particularly those who had not yet married, seemed more accepting of the change. For them, Gunnar's decision represented practical leadership, the willingness to make hard choices for the greater good. But their approval carried its own weight, suggesting that future marriages might be viewed more as political arrangements than permanent bonds between individuals. For Thyra, standing beside Gunnar as the ceremony progressed, the reality of what she was inheriting was beginning to sink in. She had focused so intently on securing the marriage alliance that she had perhaps not fully considered what it would mean to step into another woman's life so completely. The Great Hall would become her domain, but it would always carry the memory of Solveig's presence. The clan members she would need to work with had decades of loyalty to the woman she was replacing. There was also the uncomfortable reality that her own marriage would be scrutinized more intensely than most. Everyone would be watching to see if she succeeded where Solveig had failed, if she could produce the children that would justify this painful transition. The pressure to conceive quickly would be enormous, and the consequences of any delay or difficulty would be magnified by the very public nature of her arrival. The clan members themselves were wrestling with conflicting loyalties and uncertain futures. Some had benefited directly from Solveig's healing skills and felt genuine affection for her. Others understood the political advantages of the Ravensholm alliance and supported Gunnar's decision as necessary leadership. A few seemed to be calculating how the change might affect their own positions within the clan hierarchy. The older women in particular watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. Many of them had experienced their own struggles with fertility, their own fears about their husband's patience, and their clan's expectations. Seeing Solveig cast aside after 20 years of faithful service reminded them uncomfortably of their own vulnerability. If a healer as skilled and respected as Solveig could be divorced for childlessness, what security did any of them really possess? The younger women, especially those not yet married, were learning a harsh lesson about the realities of their society. Beauty and fertility were valuable assets, but they were also temporary ones. The marriage that seemed secure today could be dissolved tomorrow if circumstances changed or if political necessities required new alliances. Elder Torsten, watching, all these undercurrents of emotion and calculation swirl around the sacred hearthstones, felt the weight of his responsibility as law speaker and keeper of clan wisdom. The ceremony he was conducting was technically correct, according to their customs, but something about it felt deeply wrong to his experienced soul. The legal dissolution of marriage bonds was simple enough, but the human cost of what they were doing seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. As he looked at the three people whose lives hung in the balance, Gunnar struggling with guilt and hope, Thyra radiating confidence tinged with uncertainty, Solveig maintaining dignity despite her pain, he found himself thinking not about law and custom, but about the deeper truths he had learned during his long life. The hearthstones that surrounded them had witnessed many changes over the decades, but they endured because they were built on solid foundations. Human relationships, he was beginning to realize, required the same kind of fundamental stability. If they were to weather the storms that life inevitably brought. The knife in his hand seemed to grow heavier as these thoughts swirled through his mind, and the marriage cord lying before him began to look less like a legal formality and more like a symbol of everything that could be lost when practical considerations overwhelmed the bonds that connected one human heart to another. Elder Torsten's walking staff leaned against his judgment seat, its carved surface telling the story of a life measured in losses as much as victories. The ancient wood bore runes that marked the deaths of his 3 wives and 2 sons, each symbol cut deep into the grain during the dark nights when grief had demanded some physical expression of unbearable pain. The staff had been his companion through 7 decades of life, supporting his steps as his body grew frail, but his memory remained sharp as winter steel. As he held the ceremonial knife and watched the 3 lives poised for irrevocable change, Torsten's mind drifted to his own history of love and loss. His first wife, Ingrid, had been barely 16 when they married, a political alliance arranged by their fathers to unite 2 minor branches of the clan. He had been 22, already proven in battle, but still young enough to believe that duty and affection would naturally grow into love given sufficient time. Ingrid had been dutiful and beautiful, bearing him 2 sons before she died of the wasting sickness in their 7th year of marriage. He could still remember her final words, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper: "Take care of our boys, and find them a mother who will love them as I have." Even facing death, she had thought of others before herself, displaying the selfless grace that had made her respected throughout the clan. His second wife, Astrid, had been a widow with children of her own when they married 5 years later. Their union had been born of practical necessity. He needed help raising his sons. She needed protection and support for her daughters. But what began as convenience had grown into something deeper than either had expected. Astrid had loved his boys as her own, and he had embraced her daughters with genuine fatherly affection. For 15 years, their blended family had been a source of strength and joy. Then the fever took both his sons during a single terrible week, along with one of Astrid's daughters. The plague that swept through the region that year showed no mercy to youth or health, cutting down the strong as easily as the weak. Torsten had watched helplessly as his carefully built family crumbled before an enemy that could not be fought with sword or strategy. Astrid had survived the fever, but not the grief. She had withdrawn into herself, speaking less each day until finally she spoke not at all. One morning he had found her beside the stream, where she often went to wash clothes. Her body still warm, but her spirit already departed to whatever realm awaited those who chose to leave life behind, rather than endure its burdens. His third wife, Sigrid, had been different from the others. older, wiser, already past childbearing age when they married. She had been the clan's wise woman, skilled in herb lore and the reading of omens. Their marriage had been one of companionship rather than passion. Two souls who had experienced enough loss to appreciate the simple comfort of shared silence and understanding. Sigrid had lived longer than the others, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 68 after 20 years of marriage. But even her gentle passing had carried its own pain, because by then Torsten understood that love was not something that grew easier with experience. Each loss carved deeper wounds, not shallower ones, because each relationship taught him more about what he was losing. Now, at 72, he stood as the clan's elder precisely because he had outlived so many others. His authority came not from strength or wealth, but from the accumulated wisdom of surviving more pain than most people could imagine. He had learned to see beyond the immediate moment to the longer patterns that shaped human lives, to understand the difference between what people thought they wanted and what they actually needed. Looking at Gunnar, Torsten saw a man making the same mistake he himself had made in his youth, believing that practical considerations could substitute for the deeper bonds that sustained a marriage through difficult times. Gunnar was focused on the immediate problem of succession, the political advantages of the Ravensholm alliance, the clan's need for stability and continuity. These were real concerns, but they addressed only the surface of what marriage actually meant. What Gunnar could not see, because he was still young enough to believe that problems could be solved through decisive action, was that some things once lost could never be recovered. The easy intimacy he shared with Solveig, built through 20 years of shared experience, could not be replicated with a new wife, regardless of her other virtues. The trust that came from weathering storms together, the comfort of being known completely by another person, the peace that came from having nothing left to prove to each other, these were treasures that could only be earned through time and shared struggle. Torsten remembered his own moments of doubt during his marriages, times when he had wondered if different choices might have led to better outcomes. After Ingrid's death, he had sometimes imagined what life might have been like if he had married a healthier woman who could have given him more children. After the plague took his sons, he had tormented himself with thoughts of what might have happened if he had sent them away from the infected area earlier. But age and experience had taught him that such speculation was both pointless and dangerous. Life was not a series of problems to be solved through better decision-making, but a river to be navigated with whatever grace and wisdom one could muster. The relationships that mattered were not those that avoided all difficulties, but those that endured through difficulty and emerged stronger on the other side. Looking at Solveig, Torsten saw a woman who embodied exactly the kind of quiet strength that he had learned to value above all other qualities. She had accepted 20 years of disappointment about children without becoming bitter or resentful. She had channeled her maternal instincts into caring for the entire clan, healing their bodies and comforting their spirits when they faced their own dark times. She had supported Gunnar through every challenge of leadership without seeking credit or recognition for herself. Most importantly, she was facing this ultimate rejection with dignity and grace, thinking of the clan's welfare even as her own world crumbled. This was not the behavior of a woman who deserved to be cast aside, but of one who demonstrated the kind of character that made marriages strong and communities stable. Looking at Thera, Torsten saw youth and ambition and the dangerous confidence that came from never having been truly tested by life's hardest blows. She was beautiful and intelligent and politically valuable, but she had not yet learned the deeper lessons that could only be taught by loss and disappointment. Her marriage to Gunnar would begin with hope and passion, but when the inevitable difficulties arose, and they always arose, what foundation would they have to sustain them? The walking staff beside his chair seemed to pulse with the weight of all these memories and observations. Each carved rune represented not just a death, but a lesson about the fragility of human connections and the importance of treasuring what one possessed rather than always seeking something better. The staff had supported him through his darkest moments, just as the memories of his wives' love continued to sustain him even after their deaths. Now, as he prepared to speak the words that would sever Gunnar and Solveig's marriage bonds, Torsten felt the full weight of his responsibility as keeper of the clan's wisdom. The law was clear about what he was supposed to do, but his conscience was equally clear about what needed to be said. Sometimes the most important duty of an elder was not to follow protocol, but to speak truths that others were too young or too involved to see clearly. The fire in the central hearth flickered lower, as if the spirits themselves were waiting to see what he would choose, the safe path of legal procedure, or the more dangerous path of speaking from the heart about matters that cut deeper than law and custom could reach. Elder Torsten's single grey eye swept across the hall to the narrow windows that looked out upon the burial mounds of Clan Svolder's ancestors. The ancient graves, marked by standing stones, weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, stretched across the hillside like a testament to the permanence of death, in contrast to the fleeting nature of human struggles. Those mounds held the remains of countless generations who had faced their own choices between duty and desire, between practical necessity and the deeper bonds that connected one soul to another. The sight of those burial grounds triggered something deep within the old man's chest, not just memory, but a profound understanding of what truly mattered when viewed from the perspective of eternity. He had presided over hundreds of ceremonies in his long tenure as elder, but none had troubled him as deeply as this one. The legal dissolution of marriage bonds was simple enough, but what they were witnessing here cut to the very heart of what made a community strong and enduring. Slowly, deliberately, Torsten set down the ceremonial knife without making the cut that would sever the marriage cord. The soft sound of metal touching wood seemed to echo through the hall like thunder, and every person present understood that something unexpected was about to happen. "Stop," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of accumulated wisdom. "Before this cord is cut and these bonds are severed forever, there are words that must be spoken, not as your law speaker, but as a man who has walked this path before you and learned truths that cannot be found in scrolls or customs." The hall fell into a silence so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed loud as a storm. Gunnar's face showed shock and confusion. This was not how divorce proceedings were supposed to unfold. Thyra's green eyes flashed with something that might have been annoyance or concern. Solveig alone seemed unsurprised, as if she had been waiting for someone to acknowledge that this moment required more than legal formality. Torsten rose from his judgment seat, his weathered hands gripping his walking staff for support. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of personal experience rather than official authority. "Gunnar Ironhand, son of Magnus, you stand before me today, seeking to cast aside a woman who has shared your bed, your board, and your burdens for 20 winters. You speak of duty to the clan, of the need for heirs, of political alliances that will strengthen our people. These are not empty words, they carry truth and weight. But there are other truths that must be spoken before this deed is done." He paused, his grey eye moving from face to face around the hall, seeing not just the immediate participants, but the entire community that would be shaped by what happened here. "We have buried 3 wives," Torsten continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his purpose. "Each time I believed I understood what I was losing. Each time I discovered that my understanding was as shallow as spring ice compared to the depths beneath. You speak of replacing Solveig as if she were a broken tool that could be discarded for a newer model. But love is not a tool, and the bonds between husband and wife are not trade goods to be exchanged when better terms are offered." Gunnar shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving unconsciously to the amber pendant at his throat, the wedding gift from Solveig that he still wore. "Elder, I do not take this decision lightly. The clan's future, Torsten interrupted, lies not in the children who may or may not be born, but in the example we set for those who are already here. What are we teaching our young people about marriage, about loyalty, about the meaning of the vows they will one day speak? That promises are only binding when convenient? That love can be discarded when it fails to produce the desired results? He turned his attention to Thyra, and his voice carried a gentleness that somehow made his words more cutting than anger would have. Thyra, Eric's daughter, you are young and beautiful and full of hope for the future. You see a marriage alliance that will elevate your status and secure your clan's position. But what foundation are you building this marriage upon? The ashes of another woman's dreams? The broken promises of a man who has already proven he will cast aside a wife when she no longer serves his purposes? Thyra's chin lifted defiantly. I offer what Solveig cannot. Youth, fertility, the promise of children to carry forward the bloodline of Svolder. You offer hope, Torsten acknowledged. But hope built on the destruction of existing bonds is like a house built on sand. What will you do when your own youth fades? When your beauty diminishes with age and childbearing? When the trials of life test your marriage as they test all marriages? Will you remember this moment and wonder when your husband might look at you as he now looks at Solveig, as an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be cherished? The fire in the central hearth seemed to dim as Torsten's words settled over the hall like a heavy blanket. Several of the older women nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing truths they had lived but never heard spoken so plainly. But it was to Solveig that Torsten directed his most important words. Solveig, daughter of healers, keeper of ancient wisdom, you have borne the weight of blame for 20 years for something that may not even be your fault. The wise women speak of many causes for childlessness. Some lie with the woman, some with the man, some with the gods themselves. But you have accepted this burden without complaint, channeling your maternal love into caring for an entire clan. You have healed bodies and comforted spirits. You have stood beside a husband through victory and defeat. You have proven yourself worthy of honor, not abandonment. Solveig's eyes filled with tears she had been fighting to contain, but her voice remained steady when she replied, Elder, I do not contest the divorce. If my husband believes the clan will be better served by another wife, then I will not stand in the way of that choice. And that, Torsten said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, is exactly why this divorce should not proceed. You speak of the clan's welfare above your own pain. You offer forgiveness to the man who is casting you aside. You demonstrate the very qualities that make a marriage strong and enduring. These are not the actions of a woman who deserves to be replaced, but of one who should be treasured. He turned back to Gunnar, and now his voice carried the full weight of his authority as elder and the accumulated wisdom of his years. Gunnar Ironhand, I've watched you grow from a boy into a warrior, from a warrior into a leader. I have seen you make hard choices and bear difficult burdens. But this choice, this abandonment of a faithful wife for the promise of political advantage, this is not the action of a true leader. This is the action of a man who has forgotten that strength lies not in the ability to take what you want, but in the wisdom to value what you already possess. The burial mounds visible through the windows seemed to pulse with the presence of ancestors who had faced their own difficult choices. Torsten gestured toward them with his walking staff. Out there lie the bones of men and women who understood what you are about to forget, that we are remembered not for what we acquired, but for how we treated those who depended on us. Not for the alliances we made, but for the promises we kept. Not for the children we sired, but for the love we honored. His voice grew quiet but carried clearly through the silent hall. Cut that cord if you must, Gunnar Ironhand. Dissolve these marriage bonds and take your new wife. But know this, you will spend the rest of your life learning the difference between what you thought you wanted and what you actually needed. And by then, the woman who could have taught you that difference will be lost to you forever. The hall remained frozen in absolute silence as the full impact of Torsten's words settled over everyone present. This was no longer a simple legal proceeding, but a moment of truth that would define not just 3 individual lives, but the very character of their community. The circle of clan members that formed the witness ring around the central fire had become more than just observers. They were participants in a moment that would echo through generations of Svolder memory. Each face in that ring reflected the impact of Elder Torsten's words differently. Some showed shock at hearing their respected elder challenge a decision that had seemed inevitable. Others nodded with the recognition that comes when someone finally voices thoughts that have been troubling the heart but could not find expression. Old Bjorn the blacksmith, whose life Solveig had saved during that terrible winter 20 years past, wiped tears from his weathered cheeks without shame. Beside him, his wife Astrid clutched their youngest grandson closer, perhaps thinking of her own marriage and the vows she had spoken in this same hall decades earlier. The boy, too young to fully understand the adult complexities unfolding before him, sensed the gravity of the moment and remained perfectly still. Near the great doors, Jarl Erik the Bold stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. The marriage alliance he had carefully negotiated was being challenged not by political opposition, but by something far more dangerous, moral authority speaking truth to power. His weathered hands, marked by countless battles, clenched and unclenched as he calculated the implications of this unexpected development. The younger warriors who had initially supported Gunnar's decision now exchanged uncertain glances. They had thought they were witnessing a practical demonstration of leadership, the willingness to make hard choices for the greater good. But Torsten's words had reframed the entire situation, asking questions about honor and loyalty that went far deeper than political strategy. Among the clan's women, the impact was even more profound. Those who were married found themselves thinking of their own relationships, wondering how secure their own bonds truly were, if childlessness or other misfortunes might someday make them inconvenient to their husbands. The unmarried women faced an even more troubling question. What kind of marriage could they hope for in a community where 20 years of faithful service could be discarded when political advantage demanded it? Gunnar himself stood frozen in the center of this emotional storm, his worldview cracking like ice under spring pressure. The amber pendant at his throat seemed to grow heavier with each of Torsten's words, its familiar weight now feeling like an accusation rather than a comfort. His eyes moved unconsciously to Solveig, seeing her perhaps for the first time in years not as the symbol of his failure to produce an heir, but as the woman who had stood beside him through every triumph and defeat of his adult life. He remembered suddenly the night after his first major victory as war leader, when he had returned from a raid that had gone disastrously wrong despite bringing home substantial plunder. 3 good men had died due to his tactical error, and he had sat alone in their chamber convinced that the clan would remove him from leadership once the families of the dead demanded justice. Solveig had found him there, staring at his bloodied hands and lost in self-recrimination. She had not offered empty words of comfort or false reassurance about his leadership abilities. Instead, she had simply sat beside him in silence until he was ready to speak, then listened to his confession of guilt and fear without judgment. When he finally asked what he should do, she had given him the wisest counsel of his life. Honor their sacrifice by learning from your mistake, she had said. Face the families of the dead with truth instead of excuses. Lead better tomorrow because of what happened today. It was advice that had shaped his entire approach to leadership, the recognition that strength came not from avoiding failure, but from accepting responsibility and growing from setbacks. That wisdom had made him the leader he became. Yet now he was preparing to cast aside the woman who had taught it to him, Thyra, standing beside him in her fine gown with its golden brooches, felt the ground shifting beneath her own carefully laid plans. She had expected this ceremony to be a formality, a necessary step before claiming her place as the new lady of Svolder. Instead, she found herself being judged not for her beauty or political value, but for her character and the foundation she was building her future upon. The elder's words about building on the ashes of another woman's dreams struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She had told herself that Solveig was being set aside fairly, that childlessness was a legitimate ground for divorce, that the political alliance served everyone's interests. But hearing the situation, described in terms of destroyed promises and abandoned loyalty, forced her to confront questions she had been avoiding. What did it say about her own character that she was willing to step into another woman's place so easily? What did it reveal about her understanding of marriage that she saw Solveig's 20 years of service as irrelevant compared to her own youth and fertility? Most troubling of all, what kind of foundation was she truly building for her own future happiness? For the first time since arriving at Svolder, Thyra allowed herself to imagine being in Solveig's position, older, childless, despite years of trying, watching her husband prepare to replace her with someone younger and more fertile. The image was deeply disturbing, not just because of the personal pain it would involve, but because of what it revealed about the nature of the marriage she was entering. Solveig herself felt something shifting in the depths of her soul as Torsten's words washed over her. For 20 years, she had carried the burden of guilt and shame about her childlessness, accepting the whispered judgments and pitying looks as her just due. She had internalized the belief that her failure to conceive made her less valuable as a woman and a wife, that her other contributions to clan life were insufficient compensation for this fundamental inadequacy. But the elder's words offered a different perspective, one that honored her years of service, acknowledged her sacrifices, and recognized her dignity as a person, rather than simply measuring her value as a breeding vessel. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel anger about how she was being treated, not just sadness about what she was losing. The healing pouch at her side seemed to pulse with the weight of all the lives she had saved, all the comfort she had provided, all the wisdom she had shared with younger women learning to manage households and raise children. These contributions had real value, she began to realize, value that went far beyond the biological function she had been unable to fulfill. Around the witness ring, conversations were taking place without words as clan members exchanged meaningful glances and slight nods. The community was processing Torsten's challenge to their assumptions about marriage, loyalty, and the true meaning of strength. Some were remembering their own wedding vows, perhaps for the first time in years, and thinking about what those promises actually meant when tested by life's inevitable difficulties. The fire in the central hearth flickered and danced, its flames casting shifting shadows on the carved walls where the runes of their ancestors seemed to writhe with life. The smoke that rose from the sacred flames carried the prayers and hopes of generations. And now it carried also the weight of a decision that would define what kind of people they chose to be. Elder Torsten stood with his walking staff in hand, having spoken the truths that had been burning in his heart, but knowing that the final choice still lay with others. He had done what conscience demanded, given voice to the wisdom earned through 7 decades of life, love, and loss. Now he could only wait to see whether that wisdom would be heard and heeded, or dismissed in favor of more immediate concerns. The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and fraught with consequence. 3 lives hung in the balance, but more than that, the very soul of their community awaited definition. Would they be people who honored their deepest commitments even when tested by disappointment and difficulty? Or would they be people who discarded sacred bonds when they became inconvenient or politically disadvantageous? The answer lay not in law or custom, but in the hearts of those who would choose what to value most when forced to decide between competing goods. And that answer would shape not just the immediate future, but the legacy they would leave for the children who watched and learned from every choice the adults made. The marriage bonds lay coiled on the small table before Elder Torsten's seat like a sleeping serpent. The braided fibers that had once symbolized unity, now waiting to be severed forever. The rope itself told the story of their wedding day, woven from flax that had been blessed at the shrine of Frigg, twisted with threads of wool, dyed the deep blue of loyalty and the gold of prosperity. 20 years of marriage had not dimmed its colors, and the careful craftsmanship remained as sound as the day it had been made. Gunnar's hand trembled as he reached for the ceremonial knife that Torsten had set aside. The weight of the blade seemed enormous, far heavier than any weapon he had wielded in battle. This was not steel being drawn against an enemy, but against the most sacred bond two people could share. The knife that had been forged specifically for marriage ceremonies carried engravings of intertwined serpents, symbols of eternal connection that now mocked the very purpose for which he was about to use it. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The single word seemed to echo through the hall with the force of a battle cry, stopping every breath and stilling every heartbeat. His hand remained extended toward the knife, but his fingers could not quite close around the handle. Solveig watched her husband's hesitation with emotions too complex for simple naming. Part of her hoped desperately that he would find the strength to stop this dissolution, to remember what they had built together and choose to fight for it, rather than discard it. But another part of her, wounded by months of watching him plan her replacement, wondered if this hesitation was merely guilt rather than genuine change of heart. "The clan is waiting," Thyra said softly, her voice carrying the slightest edge of urgency. She had invested too much in this moment to see it slip away due to last-minute doubts. The golden arm ring on her wrist caught the firelight as she moved closer to Gunnar, a reminder of all the wealth and political advantage her marriage would bring to Svolder. But Gunnar's eyes were fixed on the marriage bonds, seeing not just rope and fiber, but the physical manifestation of 20 years of shared life. He remembered the moment those same cords had been wound around his and Solveig's joined hands, the weight of the promises he had spoken, the joy he had felt at binding his life to hers. "I spoke vows," he said, his voice growing stronger but still thick with emotion. "Before these same witnesses, in this same hall, I promised to honor and protect her through all the seasons of our lives. I swore by Thor's hammer and Odin's spear that nothing would break the bonds between us save death itself." Elder Torsten nodded slowly, recognizing the battle between duty and conscience that was being fought in the younger man's heart. "And what do those vows mean to you now, Gunnar Ironhand?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the central fire. Around the witness ring, clan members leaned forward unconsciously, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple divorce ceremony. This was a moment of moral choosing that would define not just Gunnar's character, but the values their entire community would embrace. "They mean," Gunnar said slowly, each word seeming to cost him great effort, "that I have already broken my most sacred promise. Not through this ceremony, but through the months of planning it. Through the conversations with other clans about replacement wives. Through allowing myself to see the woman who has stood beside me for 20 years as an obstacle to be removed, rather than a partner to be cherished." Thyra's face went pale as she began to understand that the future she had so carefully planned might be slipping away from her. "Gunnar, you cannot let emotion override wisdom. The clan needs leaders who keep their word," Gunnar interrupted, his voice now carrying some of the authority that had made him respected as a war chief. "How can I ask my warriors to follow me into battle if they know I will abandon them when they are no longer useful? How can I expect loyalty from those who serve me if I demonstrate that my own loyalty can be purchased with political advantage?" He turned to face Solveig fully for the first time since the ceremony had begun, seeing her not through the lens of disappointment about children, but as the person who had shared his life through triumph and defeat, and prosperity and hardship, youth and the approaching edge of age. "Solveig," he said, and her name seemed to carry 20 years of history in its 2 syllables. "I have wronged you in ways that go far deeper than this ceremony. I've allowed my fears about the future to blind me to the value of what we have built together. I've treated your childlessness as a failure when it may simply be the will of the gods, and I have forgotten that there are many ways to leave a legacy beyond producing heirs." Solveig's composure, which had remained steady throughout the formal proceedings and even during Torsten's challenging speech, finally began to crack. Tears she had been holding back for months started to flow, not tears of sadness but of something more complex, relief mixed with cautious hope. Love complicated by justified anger. And what of the alliance with Ravensholm? She asked, her voice steady despite her tears. What of the clan's need for political strength and the promise of children who could secure our future? It was a question that cut to the heart of the matter, acknowledging the real concerns that had driven them to this point, while demanding to know if those concerns were truly worth the price being asked. Gunnar looked around the hall, seeing the faces of people he had led for years, people who had trusted him to make decisions that would ensure their prosperity and security. Some of them clearly hoped he would proceed with the divorce, believing that political alliances and the promise of heirs outweighed personal loyalty. Others seemed to be silently urging him to honor his original vows. To choose love over advantage, I do not know, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice carried more strength than any false certainty could have. I cannot promise you children or guarantee that our enemies will not take advantage of any weakness they perceive in our position. I can only promise you that whatever challenges we will face them together, as we swore to do 20 years ago. The marriage bonds seemed to glow in the firelight, their colors deepening as if responding to the emotions swirling through the hall. The knife remained untouched on the table, its purpose suddenly uncertain. What had begun as a ceremony to sever sacred ties had become something else entirely, a moment of choosing between competing visions of what strength and leadership actually meant. Thyra stood perfectly still, her green eyes moving from Gunnar to Solveig to the watching clan members, calculating the implications of this unexpected development. Her entire future had been built around this marriage alliance, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. But more than personal disappointment, she felt something else, a strange sense of relief that she would not, after all, be building her happiness on the destruction of another woman's life. The fire in the central hearth flared suddenly brighter, as if the gods themselves were bearing witness to this moment of choosing between love and practicality, between loyalty and advantage, between the promises that could be easily broken and the bonds that endured through all seasons of life. The tears that fell in the hall of Clan Svolder that day would be remembered for generations, not because Vikings were ashamed to weep, but because these tears came from the deepest wells of human emotion, drawn up by truths too powerful to contain. They were tears of honor, shed by proud people who had been forced to confront the difference between what they thought they wanted and what their hearts actually needed. Gunnar was the first to break completely. The warrior who had faced Saxon shields and Norse berserkers without flinching found himself overwhelmed by the weight of nearly destroying the most precious thing in his life. His tears came not as weakness, but as recognition, the painful acknowledgement of how close he had come to making an irreversible mistake that would have haunted him until his death. "Forgive me," he whispered to Solveig, his voice breaking like a boy's. "Forgive me for forgetting that strength lies not in acquiring new treasures, but in protecting what is already precious. Forgive me for measuring our marriage by what it lacks, rather than treasuring what it has given us." He sank to his knees before her, this proud war chief who had never bowed to any enemy, humbling himself before the woman he had nearly cast aside. The gesture sent ripples of shock through the watching clan. They had never seen their leader show such vulnerability, such raw emotion. Solveig looked down at her husband, seeing him perhaps for the first time in years, not as the source of her disappointment, but as the man she had chosen to love 20 winters ago. Her own tears flowed freely now, washing away months of accumulated hurt and resentment. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, reaching down to cup his face in her healing hands. "We both forgot for a while what we meant to each other. We both allowed the clan's expectations to overshadow our own understanding of what marriage should be." But even as she spoke words of forgiveness, Her tears carried the memory of every lonely night when he had seemed like a stranger, every whispered conversation about his future wife, every moment when she had felt invisible in her own home. The pain of nearly losing him would take time to heal completely, but the foundation for that healing was being laid in this moment of raw honesty. Thyra stood frozen between them, no longer the confident bride-to-be, but a young woman watching the collapse of everything she had planned for her future. Her tears came differently, not from the joy of reunion, but from the complex realization that she had been willing to build her happiness on another woman's sorrow. "I am sorry," she said, her voice small but clear in the hushed hall. "I am sorry for seeing only what I wanted, and not understanding what I was truly asking you to destroy. I told myself this was just politics, just practical alliance building. But Elder Torsten is right. I was building on ashes, and no good can come from such foundations." Her golden arm ring caught the firelight as she reached up to touch her own tears, perhaps surprised by their presence. This was not how she had imagined this day ending, but something in her heart felt lighter despite the disappointment. "I will not contest this choice," she continued, looking directly at Gunnar with a dignity that proved her father had raised her well. "A marriage should begin with hope, not with the destruction of existing love. Find another way to secure your alliances, one that does not require breaking sacred bonds." Elder Torsten watched these tears fall with his own eyes damp. But his were tears of satisfaction, the deep joy that comes from seeing wisdom prevail over expedience, love triumph over fear. His walking staff trembled in his weathered hands as he witnessed the healing that his words had made possible. "These are tears of honor," he proclaimed, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Tears shed in the service of truth, in the recognition of what truly matters. Let no one who witnesses this day ever be ashamed of weeping when conscience calls us to choose between convenience and righteousness." Around the witness ring, other clan members found their own eyes wet with emotion. Old Bjorn the blacksmith wept openly, remembering his own wife's faithful care during his worst illness. Astrid held her grandson closer, thinking of the marriage vows she had spoken decades ago and how precious those promises had become over the years. The younger warriors, who had initially supported the divorce, looked uncomfortable but thoughtful, perhaps beginning to understand that true strength sometimes meant honoring commitments, even when they became difficult. The unmarried women watched with a mixture of relief and hope, seeing that marriage could mean something deeper than political arrangement or temporary convenience. Jarl Eric the Bold stood near the great doors, with his face unreadable, but those who knew him well could see the calculation in his eyes. The marriage alliance he had negotiated was dissolving, but perhaps something could be salvaged from this unexpected development. A leader who chose loyalty over advantage might prove to be exactly the kind of ally worth having. Even without the formal bonds of marriage to tie their clans together, Gunnar rose slowly from his knees, reaching for the ceremonial knife one final time. But instead of moving toward the marriage bonds, he turned the blade toward himself and cut away a strip of cloth from his own sleeve. This he wound around the original cords that bound him to Solveig, adding new fibers to the old in a gesture that spoke of renewal rather than severance. "Before all these witnesses," he declared, his voice now strong and certain, "I renew the vows I spoke 20 years ago, not because law requires it, but because my heart demands it. Whatever children may or may not bless our union, whatever alliances we may or may not secure, whatever challenges we may face, we will face them together, as we promised to do when we were young and thought love could conquer all." He paused, his eyes meeting Solveig's with an intensity that had been missing for too long. "I know now that love does not conquer all," he continued, "but I also know that love endures all, if we have the wisdom to protect it and the courage to choose it over easier paths." Solveig stepped forward to place her own hands on the renewed bonds, her healing touch seeming to bless the commitment they were making. "I, too, renew my vows," she said, "not as the girl who thought marriage would be simple, But as the woman who has learned that the deepest joys come from weathering storms together rather than sailing always in calm waters, the fire in the central hearth blazed higher as if in celebration, casting dancing shadows that made the carved runes on the walls seem to writhe with approval. The tears that had fallen on the sacred stones would be absorbed into the foundation of the hall, becoming part of the structure that would shelter future generations and future ceremonies. Elder Torsten smiled through his own tears, understanding that this was what his long life had been, preparing him for this moment when accumulated wisdom could make the difference between a community that honored its deepest values and one that sacrificed them for temporary advantage. The tears of honor had washed away the fear and doubt that had nearly destroyed a marriage, revealing underneath the enduring foundation of love that had been there all along, waiting to be remembered and renewed. The new dawn that broke over Clan Svolder, 3 days after the ceremony that changed everything, carried a quality of light that seemed different from ordinary mornings. Golden sunlight streamed through the smoke hole at the apex of the great hall, illuminating the sacred space where lives had been torn apart and then woven back together stronger than before. The beam of light fell directly across the central hearth, where the fire had burned continuously since that transformative day, its flames now tended by hands that understood their deeper significance. Solveig knelt beside the hearthstones, adding carefully selected herbs to the morning fire, not for any practical purpose, but as an offering of gratitude to whatever gods or spirits had guided them through their darkest moment to this unexpected dawn. The smoke that rose from the blessed flames carried her prayers of thanksgiving skyward, where it mingled with the morning mist that clung to the burial mounds on the hillside. The healing pouch at her side had been replenished with fresh herbs gathered at first light. But it carried more than medicine now. It held also the renewed sense of purpose that came from understanding her true worth to the clan. She was no longer just the woman who had failed to produce an heir, but the keeper of ancient wisdom, the healer whose knowledge had saved countless lives, the wife whose loyalty had been tested and proven unbreakable. Gunnar found her there as he did each morning now, drawn by a need to begin each day with acknowledgement of what he had almost lost. The amber pendant still hung at his throat, but its weight felt different, no longer a guilty reminder of broken promises, but a symbol of love that had endured through doubt and emerged purified by trial. The traders from the eastern settlements arrived during the night, he told her, settling beside the fire with the comfortable intimacy of a man who no longer took his marriage for granted. They bring word that the harvest festivals have been bountiful this year, and several young couples are seeking places to settle and raise families. It was a conversation they could have easily in the past, practical discussions about clan business and the management of their growing prosperity. But now, such talks carried deeper undertones of partnership restored and mutual respect rediscovered. Perhaps, Solveig said thoughtfully, we should consider what Elder Torsten said about there being many ways to leave a legacy. If the gods have not granted us children of our blood, perhaps we are meant to be parents to children of our choosing, young people who need guidance and opportunity to build their own futures. The idea had been growing in both their minds since that day in the hall when everything had changed. Adoption was not uncommon among their people, and a successful clan leader often took promising young men as foster sons, training them in the arts of leadership and warfare. But this would be different, not just the strategic adoption of an heir, but the opening of their home and hearts to young families who could benefit from guidance and support. I have been thinking the same, Gunnar admitted. There is wisdom in nurturing the next generation in all its forms, not just through our own bloodline. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thera, who had remained in Svolder as an honored guest while new arrangements were negotiated with her father. The young woman who approached them bore little resemblance to the confident bride-to-be who had stood ready to claim another woman's place. Her golden hair was braided simply, without the elaborate ornaments she had worn during the failed ceremony, and her dress was practical wool rather than the finest fabrics that had marked her status. "I wanted to speak with you before I returned to Ravensholm," she said, her voice carrying a maturity that had been earned through difficult experience. "To thank you for teaching me something I could not have learned any other way." Solveig looked up from the fire with genuine curiosity. "What lesson do you mean?" "That the most valuable things in life cannot be taken by force or claimed through advantage," Thyra replied. "They must be earned through patience, loyalty, and the willingness to choose love even when it becomes difficult. I thought I understood marriage because I understood politics and alliance building, but I know now that I understood nothing at all." She paused, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as she gathered her thoughts. "When I return home, I will not be the same woman who left seeking a marriage of convenience. I will look for a man who values partnership over politics, who chooses loyalty over advantage. And if the gods grant me such a marriage, I will remember what I witnessed here, that true strength lies not in always getting what you want, but in protecting what you already have." Gunnar nodded with the respect due to someone who had shown grace in disappointment. "Your father may be disappointed that the alliance he sought did not come to pass." "Perhaps," Thyra acknowledged. "But I think he will be proud to see that his daughter learned to recognize true honor when she encountered it. And who knows? Perhaps there are other ways for our clans to support each other that do not require the sacrifice of existing bonds." She was right, of course. In the days since the ceremony, informal discussions had already begun about trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that could serve both clans' interests without requiring marriage alliances. Sometimes the most valuable partnerships were those freely chosen, rather than sealed by blood or law. Elder Torsten joined them at the hearth, moving slowly but with the satisfaction of a man who had spoken difficult truths and seen them bear fruit. His walking staff tapped against the stone floor with each step, the carved runes that marked his losses, now seeming to celebrate the wisdom those losses had taught him. "The young traders who arrived last night," he said, settling carefully onto a wooden stool, "they speak of our clan's reputation spreading throughout the region. Not for our wealth or military strength, though those remain considerable, but for our commitment to honor and the keeping of sacred vows." It was a reputation worth having, one that would attract the kind of allies and settlers who valued integrity over mere advantage. Word traveled quickly in their world, and the story of the ceremony that had ended in renewed vows rather than divorce was already being told around fires throughout the northern territories. "There will be children in this hall again," Torsten continued, his single grey eye twinkling with satisfaction. "Perhaps not born of your blood, but raised under your guidance and love. The legacy you build together will be measured not in bloodlines, but in the lives you touch and the wisdom you share." As if summoned by his words, the sound of young voices could be heard outside the hall. Several of the trader families had brought children, and the little ones were already exploring their new surroundings with the irrepressible curiosity of youth. Their laughter carried through the morning air like a promise of the life and energy that would soon fill these spaces again. Solveig smiled at the sound, her heart lifting with a hope that had nothing to do with bearing children and everything to do with loving them. Her healing skills would be needed by growing families, her knowledge passed down to a new generation of women learning to manage households and care for their communities. Gunnar felt a similar stirring of anticipation. The young men among the traders would need training in the skills of leadership and warfare. The families would need guidance in adapting to their new home. There would be opportunities to mentor and shape the future in ways that had nothing to do with direct bloodline, but everything to do with the values and wisdom that could be shared across generations. The fire in the central hearth burned steadily, its flames fed by the same hearthstones that had witnessed the clan's founding, their first celebrations, their moments of crisis and triumph. Those stones would outlast all the people gathered. Around them, But the love and loyalty demonstrated in this hall would become part of the foundation that future generations would build upon. The new dawn light continued to stream through the smoke hole, illuminating not just the physical space, but the transformed relationships within it. Where there had been doubt and fear, there was now certainty and hope. Where there had been the prospect of broken bonds, there were now connections stronger for having been tested and consciously renewed. As the morning progressed and the business of the day began in earnest, the four people who had stood at the center of that pivotal ceremony went about their tasks with the quiet satisfaction of those who had looked into the abyss of their own fears and chosen to step back toward the light. The legacy they would leave would be written not in bloodlines, but in the lives they touched, the wisdom they shared, and the example they set for all who would follow about the true meaning of honor, loyalty, and love that endures through all seasons of life. The new dawn had brought them home to themselves and to each other, and to the deeper truths that made their community not just strong, but worthy of the strength it possessed.